Sometimes deploying a remote assist can be really simple. All you need to do is assign remote assist users the licenses they need and Teams users the licenses they need. To see the specific list, please refer to the earlier section about device and product requirements. But in other cases, additional steps are required. I'll start by giving a brief overview of the 4 common deployment scenarios we've seen, and then explain the deployment options for each. So when I explain the brief overview, you might figure out what scenario you're most interested in, but I encourage you to watch this entire video because a lot of the definitions and concepts I go over at the beginning will be useful throughout. So first you'll want to ask yourself, do the people who want to use Teams, the people in purple, and the people who want to use Remote Assist, the people in green, do they have the licenses they need? And the answer will either be yes, they both already have the licenses they need, or no. Someone, either the person who wants to use Teams or the person who wants to use Remote Assist, one of those parties do not have the licenses they need. So let's just say you answer yes. What happens next depends on whether those users who already have licenses they need, whether they're in the same tenant. So if they are in the same tenant, that's scenario 1. And if they are not, that's scenario 2. We'll go into more details about these scenarios later. However, maybe you actually haven't been able to assign Remote Assist licenses and Teams licenses to the people who need them. This might be because you want someone outside your tenant, like a customer or a vendor, to use Remote Assist or Teams, and you don't know the best way to provide them with licenses. If this is your scenario, then you want to ask yourself another question, which is, do you want the out-of-tenant user to use Remote Assist, either on HoloLens or mobile? Or do you want the out-of-tenant user to use Teams, either on Teams Desktop or Teams Mobile? So now let's go into more details about scenario 1. So again, scenario 1 is when Teams users and Remote Assist users have their respective licenses in the same tenant. So let's say this is your organization's tenant, ABC. You see that Expert 1 and Expert 2 have Teams licenses in ABC, and First Line Worker 1 and First Line Worker 2 also have their licenses in tenant ABC. So if this is your scenario, you don't need to configure anything else. Once they have the licenses they need, they will be able to search and collaborate with each other. So now let's talk about the second scenario. In the second scenario, you'll see that the experts have the Teams licenses they need, and the Remote Assist users have the Remote Assist licenses they need. However, this time they're in different tenants. One of the first line workers could be in tenant X1, and another first line worker could be in tenant X2, whereas your organization uses tenant ABC. So this might be the case if, for example, in your organization, each business unit uses their own tenant, and there are experts who want to use Teams and have Teams licenses in their own tenant, and first line workers who want to use Remote Assist and have their licenses in another tenant. So in terms of next steps, it's first important to understand that there are 2 ways for Remote Assist and Teams users to be in a call together. So either one party makes an ad hoc call to the other, or both parties join a meeting together. Today, any Remote Assist user, either on mobile or on HoloLens, any Remote Assist user can be in an ad hoc call with any Teams user. They can be using Teams mobile app or Teams desktop app. But for meetings, only a Remote Assist HoloLens user can be in a meeting with a Teams desktop user. So if your organization plans to have Remote Assist HoloLens users collaborate with Teams desktop users, you can consider option 3. Otherwise, you will be picking between option 1 and option 2. So let's start by talking about option 1 and option 2 because those are applicable in a wider range of scenarios. So the first option is external access. External access is a Teams feature that allows Teams users from one entire external tenant to use Teams to find, call, chat, and set up meetings with users in your entire tenant. So let's just say that your organization has these experts and you want to support the first line workers in tenant X1 and you also want to support the first line workers in tenant X2. But you don't want the first line workers in X1 and X2 to talk to each other. Thus, you'll want to enable external access between these 2 tenants and also between these 2 tenants, but not between these 2 tenants. So how do you configure external access between your tenant and an external tenant? Well, there are 3 ways. The first way is through Open Federation, which is on by default. This just means that you're saying, hey, I am enabling other tenants who want to enable access with me to be able to do so. Or your tenant can specify a list of allowed tenants, and anyone who's not on that tenant will not be able to communicate with you, and vice versa with blocked tenants. Now let's talk about guest access, which is the second option. So guest access is a Teams feature that enables Teams admins or members to add individual users from outside their tenant into specific Teams teams and channels. The guested user gains a Teams license in the tenant they've been guested into. So here you'll see that the tenant with the remote assist user, so for example, X1, they will guest a specific expert into their X1 tenant. And when the expert is guested into this tenant, the expert will gain a Teams license in this tenant. So now expert1 at abc.com can use Teams in the ABC tenant and can use this Teams with the same credentials, but in a different tenant, in the X1 tenant. So how do you configure this? Well, each tenant that has remote assist users who want to collaborate with someone outside their tenant, they will have to guest each specific individual into one of their specific teams or channels. So now let's talk about the pros and cons of external access versus guest access. We'll start with external access. So one of the pros is that Open Federation is typically on by default, and if it's not enabled, it's easy to configure. It's just a toggle. However, one of the cons is that it requires configuration on the additional tenant side. So it's not enough just for tenant ABC to say, oh, hey, I have Open Federation. Anyone is able to communicate with me. If external tenant X1 has enabled Open Federation, then that's great. External access is already enabled. However, there might be some cases where external tenant X1 does not have Open Federation on. And so then they would do some work to either specify an allowed tenants list or a blocked tenants list. Next, Federation has fewer control features than guesting. As you see, by definition, external access enables all the Teams users in one tenant to search and collaborate with all the Teams users in another tenant. That's really different from guest access, in which one of the tenants can choose which specific individual they want to collaborate with in their own tenant. So again, back to external access, it's not available for remote assist mobile users, and also there are some feature restrictions. There's no group calling or file sharing allowed. And again, this is not something that Remote Assist can control. This is a Teams feature. So now let's talk about the pros and cons of guest access. So one of the pros, by definition, is that external tenant X1 and X2 can guest specific users into their tenants. And this is really useful if, for example, you want to really carefully control which expert one of these first-line workers can reach out to. For example, you might not want these first-line workers to be able to access and search all of these experts. You don't want them to feel inundated with requests. So in that way, guest access is very useful. And one of the cons is that it would require more user management. So let's just compare these two again. So let's just say your organization wants first-line worker 1 at x1.com to collaborate with both of these experts. Well, that would be a little bit easier to set up in external access, because once you set up external access, then this user will be able to search and collaborate with anyone in this tenant. Whereas if you're using guest access, that means that this tenant will specifically have to guest in both of these experts. So it's just 2 actions versus 1. Then something else to note is that the Teams user who is guested in will only receive notifications from other members of the tenant that they're currently in. So as I mentioned, the expert, if they are using Teams in a tenant already and they're using the same account to use Teams in another tenant, then they will have the option of switching between tenants. But this also means that when expert 1 is using Teams in the ABC tenant, they might not get incoming calls from people who are collaborating with them in the X1 tenant. So the last requirement to note is that in order to enable guest access, X1 and X2 must turn on guest access for their entire tenant. And for some customers, they've just mentioned that they do not want to enable it for their entire tenant, which is why I've listed it under the cons. So now let's talk about option 3, which is really for a pretty niche scenario in which the Remote Assist HoloLens user and a Teams desktop user are collaborating and they want to collaborate in a meeting rather than in a call. So let me kind of give an overview of what anonymous access means. So anonymous access is a tenant-wide setting, which is on by default, that enables a remote assist HoloLens user to participate in a meeting with a Teams desktop user, even if that user has a Teams license in another tenant, or even if that user does not have a Teams license at all. And this is because what happens is that when the Teams desktop user receives an invite to join the meeting, they will be able to join the meeting anonymously. And when that person joins the meeting anonymously, they don't need a Teams account. And so how do you configure this? Step one is for the tenants with remote assist users. So that in here, that would be X1 and X2. Those tenants have to enable anonymous access for their entire tenant. And then the remote assist HoloLens user will create a meeting using Teams or Outlook and send the invite to the expert's email. For example, expert1@abc.com. Then the remote assist HoloLens user will log into remote assist on HoloLens, and they will see a pop-up that gives them a button to join an upcoming meeting. So that's how the HoloLens user joins the meeting. How the expert joins the meeting is that they will go into their email, click the link, click the invite, and they will launch Teams desktop app, and they are able to use it as an anonymous participant. This means that the expert will not need a Teams license at all, but if they do, they will still be able to join the call. And a note is that the HoloLens user can invite the Teams desktop user in the situation that they need assistance, and the HoloLens user does not need to pre-configure guest access or external access or anything beforehand. So the moment that the first-line worker needs help, they'll be able to send out a meeting invite for the Teams desktop user to join the meeting. Again, this is only for organizations in which the remote assist HoloLens user is collaborating with a Teams desktop user and they want to do so via a meeting. All right, so let's talk about scenario 3. We just wrapped up 2 scenarios and what those 2 scenarios had in common is that the people who want to use remote assist have the licenses they need and the people who want to use Teams have the licenses they need. So now we're going to go into a whole different type of scenario in which the out-of-tenant user wants to use remote assist, but neither has nor wants to deploy a remote assist license. So this might be your scenario if, for example, your organization tenant is ABC, and you want expert technicians in your tenant to provide remote assistance to vendor technicians. Or you want customer support agents in your tenant to provide remote assistance to B2B customers. And you'll note that these external users do not have a remote assist license. Also, they might be in their own external tenant, or they might not be in a tenant at all. So if this is your scenario, you have 2 options. One is to deploy service accounts in your main tenant, and another is to deploy service accounts in a test tenant. So now let's go into details about what that means. So option 1, deploy service accounts in your main tenant. Step 1 is to create service accounts in your tenant. These are examples of service accounts. For example, it would be vendor1_x1@abc.com. And then your organization will need to deploy remote assist for each service account, which means assigning them the licenses that they need to use remote assist. Again, to refer to the full list of licenses, please check back on our section about device and product requirements. Then your organization will need to provide service account credentials to vendors for them to log into remote assist. So now, vendor1@x1.com, they might be using this email in their daily work, but specifically when they want to use remote assist, they will be using these credentials to log into remote assist. So once you do this, everyone in tenant ABC can search and collaborate with each other. So vendor 1 can call expert 2 can call vendor 1. Any Teams user and remote assist user is able to search and collaborate with each other. However, sometimes you actually might want to have more granular control over who can contact who. For example, you might only want the people in gold to search and collaborate with each other, and you might only want the people in pink to search and collaborate with each other. This might be the case, again, if you really want to just make sure that your vendor is only contacting the expert who's assigned to help them or to collaborate with them, rather than having the vendor be able to access and call literally any expert in that tenant. So if you want to set up these more granular controls, you would use information barriers, which is a team's policy that prevents several types of communication, such as searching for a user or placing a call with a user. And to implement information barriers, you would need one of these licenses. So I just went over the process for deploying service accounts in your main tenant. So let's talk about deploying service accounts in a test tenant. And some customers want to do this because they just want to make sure their employees are all in one tenant and they want to keep their vendors in a separate tenant because it's easier to define policies in that way. So first, you would need to create a test tenant and create service accounts inside the test tenant, then deploy Remote Assist to each service account, and then again provide these credentials to the vendors. So now this is looking pretty similar to scenario 2, where the Teams users are in one tenant and the Remote Assist users are in another. So now to enable them to communicate with each other, you have the same 3 options that you did in scenario 2, which is external access, guest access, or meetings. So we'll start with the solutions that cover the most scenarios, which again is external access and guest access. So I'll just go over this pretty briefly because I went over them in detail before. So if the Remote Assist users want to make an ad hoc call to Teams users and vice versa, then you will need to enable guest access for the test tenant and guest each of the experts that you want to collaborate with into this tenant. And again, in this diagram, I only show one test tenant, but there are scenarios where a customer might want to create a separate test tenant for each vendor company that they're working with. So the instructions that I'm mentioning now will apply there too. Or another option is for the test tenant to enable external access between the ABC tenant and the test tenant. And if you are in the specific scenario in which the vendors are using Remote Assist on HoloLens and the experts are using Teams Desktop and they want to join a meeting with each other, you can enable anonymous meetings again. And again, this is a very brief overview of the steps. So the test tenant would need to enable anonymous access, the vendor will create a meeting, invite the expert to the meeting, and both join the meeting. Great, so now we are on scenario 4, and this time the out-of-tenant user doesn't want to use Remote Assist, but they want to use Teams, but they neither have nor want to deploy a Teams license. So this might be your scenario if you want technicians in your tenant who are setting up a machine to receive remote assistance from vendors who are OEMs. And so the options, again, are a guest access, and if the Remote Assist users are using HoloLens and the OEM is using Teams Desktop, then you can use the meetings option again. These options are pretty familiar to you by now. We've gone over them a couple times, but just as a quick recap, option 1 is guest access. So the first line workers who are in tenant ABC will guest the vendors into that tenant. And again, the second option is to create meetings. So the first line worker in tenant ABC will set up the meeting, invite the vendor, and the vendor will be able to join. So again, here is the overview of the 4 common deployment scenarios, and this time I've listed a summary of the next steps.